I signed the papers on a Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, she was gone. The house, the land, everything I worked 40 years to build, all transferred to a woman I thought I'd spend forever with. I should have seen it coming. But when you're lonely enough, you'll believe anything. 5 years. That's how long it had been since Margaret died. 5 winters in street johns, each one colder than the last. I'd wake up in that house by the harbor, make coffee for one, and sit at the kitchen table staring at the chair where she used to read the paper. Some mornings I'd catch myself setting out 2 cups. Old habits die hard. I stopped believing I'd ever feel close to anyone again. I was 62 years old. My hands were rough from 40 years of working on boats. My back ached every morning. I'd accepted that this was it. This was how the rest of my life would be. Alone, quiet, safe. Then Rick showed up at my door one afternoon in March. "You need to get out of here," he said. He didn't knock. Just walked right in like he always did. "You're turning into a ghost, Percy." I told him I was fine. He shook his head. "Margaret wanted to go to the Philippines. Remember? She had that whole trip planned before she got sick." I remembered. She'd circled places on a map: Cebu, Palawan, Boracay. She wanted to see the beaches, eat mangoes, swim in water so clear you could see your feet. "So go," Rick said. "Do it for her." I booked the flight that week. I didn't think about it too much. If I had, I probably wouldn't have gone. I flew into Cebu in early April. The heat hit me like a wall when I stepped off the plane. Humid, heavy, alive. I took a taxi to a small resort on Mactan Island. Nothing fancy, just a place near the water. The first 2 days, I barely left my room. I'd sit on the balcony watching the ocean, wondering what the hell I was doing there. On the 3rd day, I went down to the restaurant for breakfast. That's when I met her. "Good morning, sir. Welcome." Her voice was soft, careful. She was standing behind the reception desk, wearing a blue polo shirt with the resort logo on it. She had long dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, and a smile that felt genuine. Not the forced kind you get from people who work in hospitality. This one reached her eyes. "I'm Diane," she said. "If you need anything during your stay, you just ask me, okay?" I nodded, ordered coffee, sat alone by the window. But I kept glancing over at her. She was talking to another guest, explaining something about tours. She was patient, kind. When she caught me looking, she smiled again. I looked away, embarrassed. That evening, I went back to the restaurant for dinner. She was still there. "You like the view?" she asked, walking over to my table. I told her it was beautiful, better than street. "John's in April, that's for sure," she laughed. "Where is Street John's?" I explained. "Canada, Newfoundland, cold, gray, fishing boats, and fog." She listened like she actually cared. "Why you come here alone?" she asked. I hesitated. Then I told her. About Margaret. About the trip she'd planned. About how I didn't know what else to do with myself. Diane sat down across from me without asking. "That's very beautiful," she said quietly. "You love her very much." We talked for over an hour. She told me about her life. She was from a small village outside Cebu City, youngest of 4 siblings. Her father had been a farmer, but he'd gotten sick, diabetes. Medical bills piled up. Her family borrowed money they couldn't pay back. She'd been working at the resort for 2 years, sending most of her salary home. "I want to go to college," she said, "but it's expensive, and my family needs me." She said it without self-pity. Just a fact. I respected that. When I finally stood up to leave, she touched my arm lightly. "You come back tomorrow. I tell you more stories about Cebu, and you tell me more about Canada." I said I would. The next night, I did. And the night after that, by the end of the week, I'd stopped eating meals alone. Diane would join me when she had breaks. We'd talk about everything. She asked about my life as a fisherman. I asked about growing up in the village. She was curious in a way that felt rare. Most people don't really listen. They just wait for their turn to talk. But Diane listened. And when she spoke, she chose her words carefully, like she was translating her thoughts from Cebuano into English as she went. It made everything she said feel more intentional, more real. On my last night, she walked me down to the beach after her shift. We sat on the sand, watching the waves. "I'm sad you go tomorrow," she said. I told her I was too, and I meant it. I hadn't felt this comfortable around someone in years. She leaned her head on my shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it hit me hard. I realized then that I'd been starving for human touch, for connection, for someone to sit beside me and not expect anything except my presence. "You come back?" she asked. I didn't answer right away. I wasn't sure. Part of me thought this was just a vacation moment, something that would fade when I got back to real life. But another part of me, the part that had been buried under 5 years of grief, said yes. "I'll come back," I told her. She smiled and squeezed my hand. I extended my flight by 2 weeks. Called Rick from the hotel. "I'm staying a bit longer," I said. He was quiet for a second. "Staying? Percy, you've been there 4 days." I told him I just needed more time, more sun, more space. I didn't mention Diane. "Not yet." Rick sighed. "All right, just don't do anything stupid." I laughed it off, but deep down, I knew I was already doing something stupid. I was falling for a 24-year-old woman I barely knew, and I didn't care. Diane and I spent every day together after that. When she wasn't working, we'd explore Cebu. She took me to places tourists don't go. Small markets where old women sold dried fish and fresh mangoes. Churches with walls covered in faded paintings of saints. Street corners where you could buy lechon that melted in your mouth. "You like it?" she'd ask every time I tried something new. I always said yes, and I always meant it, not just because the food was good or the sights were beautiful, but because I was with her. One afternoon, we took a jeepney up into the hills. She wanted to show me the view from a place called Tops. We sat on a concrete bench overlooking the city. The sky was turning orange, and the air smelled like rain. "Tell me about your wife," Diane said. I wasn't expecting that. Most people avoided the topic, but she asked it gently, like she really wanted to know. So I told her about how Margaret and I met when we were 18, about the life we built, about how she fought cancer for 3 years and never once complained, about how I held her hand the night she died and felt like half of me died with her. Diane didn't say anything for a while. Then she took my hand. "You're a good man, Percy. She was lucky to have you." That night, she invited me to a small restaurant near her apartment. It was cramped and loud, with plastic chairs and fluorescent lights. "My favorite place," she said. We ate chicken adobo and rice. She told me about her dreams. She wanted to finish her degree in tourism management. She wanted to travel, see the world, but family always comes first, she said. "That's how it is here." I asked if she resented that. She shook her head. "No, I love my family, but sometimes I feel stuck, like I'll never get out." I understood that feeling. I'd felt stuck for 5 years. "What if you didn't have to feel stuck?" I asked. She looked at me, confused. "What you mean?" I didn't have an answer yet, but the seed was planted, the idea that maybe I could help her. Maybe we could help each other. She reached across the table and held my hand. "You make me happy, Percy. I don't know how to say it better, but you do." I felt my chest tighten, not in a bad way, in a way that reminded me I was still alive. The next 2 weeks blurred together. We went to the beach. We ate street food. We stayed up late talking about everything and nothing. She made me laugh, really laugh, for the first time in years. She'd tease me about my accent. "You sound like a movie," she'd say. I'd tease her back. "You sound like music." It was cheesy, but it was true. When she spoke, I felt calm, steady, like I'd found something I didn't know I was looking for. Then came the airport. My flight back to Street John's was early in the morning. Diane insisted on coming with me. We sat in the terminal, not saying much. Finally, she started crying. Quietly, but I saw it. "I don't want you to go," she said. I wiped her tears with my thumb. "I don't want to go either." She looked up at me, her eyes red. "Then why you go?" I didn't have a good answer. Because that's where my life was? Because I had a house and a job and responsibilities? It all felt hollow. "I'll come back," I said. "I promise." She nodded, but she didn't believe me. I could see it in her face. So I said it again. "Diane, I will come back." When I landed in Street John's, the cold hit me like a slap. The sky was gray. The harbor was gray. Everything felt gray. I walked into my house and it felt smaller than before, emptier. I unpacked my bag and found a note she'd slipped into my jacket pocket. It said, "Thank you for making me smile. I miss you already." I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at it for a long time. That night, I video called her. She answered right away, her face filling the screen. "You're home," she said. I nodded. "But it doesn't feel like home anymore." She smiled. "Then where is home?" I didn't answer, but I think we both knew. We talked every day after that. Morning for me was evening for her. We'd eat meals together through the screen. She'd show me her day. I'd show her mine. She'd say, "I miss you, Percy." And I'd say, "I miss you too." And every time I said it, it hurt a little more, because I realized I wasn't just missing her. I was missing the version of myself I was when I was with her. 3 months later, I bought another ticket to Cebu. This time, I stayed for a month. I rented a small apartment near the resort where Dianne worked. It wasn't much, but it was mine, or at least it felt like mine. She'd come over after her shifts and we'd cook together. She taught me how to make sinigang. I taught her how to make fish chowder, though she said it tasted weird. "Too creamy," she'd say, wrinkling her nose. I'd laugh and tell her she just didn't understand Canadian cuisine. Canadian food is boring. She'd fire back. I couldn't argue with that. One weekend, she asked if I wanted to meet her family. I was nervous. I'm not good with families, never have been, but I said yes. We took a bus to her village. It was about an hour outside the city, down a bumpy road that turned to dirt halfway through. Her mother, Vanji, was waiting outside their house. It was small, concrete walls, tin roof, chickens running around in the yard. Vangi hugged me like I was already family. "You're Percy. Diane talks about you all the time." She had a kind face, but I noticed her eyes, tired, worn down by years of struggle. Inside, the house was cramped but clean. There was a small living room with a couch covered in plastic and a TV playing a noontime variety show. Diane's younger sister was there, shy and quiet. And then there was Kuya Joel, Diane's older brother. He was tall, thin, with a smile that came easy. Too easy. "Percy, bro. Welcome, welcome." He shook my hand hard like we were old friends. He sat down next to me, asking about Canada, about fishing, about how I met Diane. I answered politely, but something about him made me uneasy. I couldn't put my finger on it. Lunch was served, rice, grilled fish, vegetables. Vangi kept apologizing. "It's not fancy," she said. I told her it was perfect, and it was. But halfway through the meal, she started talking about money. "The hospital bills are so expensive," she said, looking down at her plate. "My husband, he needs dialysis twice a week now. We borrow from the neighbors, but it's not enough." I felt Diane tense beside me. "Mama, not now," she said quietly. Vanji looked at me. "I'm sorry. I don't mean to complain, but it's hard, you know?" I nodded. I understood hard. I'd lived through hard. "How much do you need?" I asked. The table went quiet. Diane touched my arm. "Percy, you don't have to." But I did. I couldn't sit there and do nothing. I gave Vanji $2,000 before I left. She cried. Joel hugged me. "You're family now, bro," he said. I wanted to believe that. On the drive back, Dianne was quiet. "You didn't have to do that," she said finally. "I told her I wanted to." She looked out the window. "My family, they're good people, but they'll always need help. You understand?" I did, but I didn't care. I had the money. I didn't have anyone else to spend it on. Why not help? She leaned against me in the bus. "Thank you," she whispered. I kissed the top of her head. It felt right. A few days later, Diane brought up the idea of property. We were sitting on the balcony of my apartment, watching the sunset. "You ever think about staying here?" she asked. I told her I'd thought about it. "A lot, actually. You could retire here," she said. "It's cheaper than Canada, and we could be together." I looked at her. She was serious. "You really want that?" She nodded. "I want to be with you, Percy. Not just on video calls. Not just for a few weeks. For real." My heart was pounding. I was 62. She was 24. It didn't make sense on paper, but when did love ever make sense? "What would I do here?" I asked. She smiled. "Whatever you want. You could fix boats. You could relax. You could just be happy." That word, happy, I hadn't heard it in my own head for so long. "Let me think about it," I said. She kissed me. "Okay, but don't think too long." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept imagining it. A small house near the water. Mornings with Dianne. No more winters and street johns. No more empty rooms. Just peace. Just her. The next day, I contacted a real estate agent, a cheerful woman named Percy who showed me properties all over Cebu. Most were too expensive or too far from the city, but then she showed me a place near Molbol. It was perfect. A small house with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a porch facing the ocean. The land was decent, half a hectare, enough space to breathe. "How much?" I asked. She told me. It was a lot, but I'd been saving for years. I'd sold Margaret's car, sold her jewelry, the stuff she'd wanted me to sell after she was gone. I had enough. Barely, but enough. I called Rick that night. "I'm buying a house in the Philippines," I said. There was a long silence. "Percy, what the hell are you doing?" I tried to explain. "The weather. The cost of living. Diane." He cut me off. "You barely know her, Percy. It's been, 4 months?" I told him it felt longer. It felt like I'd known her forever. "That's because you're lonely," he said. His voice was hard. "You're not thinking straight. Don't do this." I told him I'd already made up my mind. He sighed. "Then you're a damn fool." Maybe I was, but I didn't care. I proposed on a quiet beach in Molbol, just the 2 of us. The sun was setting, painting the sky pink and orange. I didn't have a ring, didn't plan a big speech. I just looked at her and said, "Dianne, will you marry me?" She stared at me for a second, like she didn't believe what she'd heard. Then she started crying. "Yes, yes, Percy, yes." She jumped into my arms and I held her tight, feeling her heartbeat against my chest. For the first time in 5 years, I felt whole. We started planning right away. Nothing big, just a small ceremony. Her family, a few friends. Maybe Rick would fly out, though I doubted it. Diane was excited. She talked about dresses and flowers and where we'd have the reception. I loved seeing her like that. Hopeful, alive. But then the lawyer brought up the problem. "You can't own land here, Eddie," Santos said. We were sitting in his office in Cebu City. He was a middle-aged man with thick glasses and a patient demeanor. "The Philippines has restrictions on foreign ownership. You need to be a citizen or married to a Filipino to own property outright." I looked at Diane. "So what do we do?" Kuya Joel, who'd insisted on coming to the meeting, leaned forward. "You put it in her name," he said. "It's the only way. You'll still live there. It's just paperwork." I frowned. "But it won't be mine?" Joel smiled. "You'll be married, bro. What's hers is yours. What's yours is hers. That's how marriage works. Addie, Santos cleared his throat. Technically, Mr. Percy, once the property is in her name, it's legally hers. If something happens, you won't have a claim to it. Nothing's going to happen, Diane said quickly. She reached over and held my hand. I would never hurt you, Percy. You know that. I looked into her eyes. She seemed so sincere, so sure, and I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe her. Okay, I said. Let's do it. Addie. Santos hesitated. Are you sure about this, sir? Once it's done, it's final. I nodded. I'm sure. The paperwork took weeks. Forms, signatures, notaries. Diane was with me for most of it, but there were moments when I'd catch her checking her phone, distracted. Everything okay? I'd ask. Just family stuff, she'd say. My mom's worried about the wedding expenses. I told her not to worry. I'd cover it. All of it. She smiled and kissed me. You're too good to me. Joel was around a lot during this time. He'd show up at my apartment unannounced. Just checking in, bro, he'd say. He'd talk about business ideas, about how he wanted to start a small sorry store. If you could lend me a little capital, I could make it work, he said one afternoon. I gave him $1,000. He thanked me, said he'd pay me back. I never saw that money again. But I was too focused on the future to care. Diane and I set a date for the wedding. 2 months after the property transfer, I imagined it all, walking down a small aisle, her in a simple white dress, starting our life together in that house by the ocean. It felt like a dream, a second chance, proof that life doesn't end when you think it does. Then we signed the final papers. It was a Tuesday. Addie, Santos laid everything out in front of me. Deeds, titles, transfer documents. This is it, he said. Once you sign, the property legally belongs to Miss Diane. I picked up the pen. My hand was shaking, not from fear, from finality, from the weight of what this meant. I glanced at Diane. She was smiling, holding my other hand. I love you, she said. I signed. She signed. Addie. Santos stamped the papers. Congratulations, he said, but his voice sounded hollow. We went back to the house that evening. My house. Her house now. Vanjie and Joel came by to celebrate. Vanjie brought a small cake. Joel brought beer. You're really one of us now, Joel said, clinking his bottle against mine. I smiled, but something felt off. Diane was happy, but she was also distant. She kept checking her phone, texting someone. Who is it? I asked. She looked up quickly. Just a friend, asking about the wedding. I didn't push. I should have. That night, we went to bed early. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Diane was asleep beside me, her breathing soft and steady. I thought about Addie, Santos's words. Once it's done, it's final. I thought about Rick's warning. You barely know her. I thought about how quickly everything had moved. Too quickly. But I pushed those thoughts away. I told myself I was just nervous, that this was normal, that everything would be fine once we were married. But deep down, I knew. Something was wrong. I just didn't want to see it. The morning after the transfer, Diane was different. Not in a way I could point to and say, there. That's the problem. Just subtle. She didn't make coffee like she usually did. She didn't kiss me good morning. She sat at the kitchen table with her phone, scrolling, her face unreadable. You okay? I asked. She glanced up. Yeah, just tired. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Wedding planning is stressful. I believed her. Or I wanted to. We spent the day running errands, picking up her dress from the seamstress, finalizing the menu for the reception. Everything felt normal on the surface. But every now and then, I'd catch her staring into space, like her mind was somewhere else. Diane, I'd say. She'd snap back. Sorry. What? I'd repeat myself. She'd nod and move on, but I could feel the distance growing. That evening, Joel stopped by. Again. Just wanted to see how you guys are doing, he said, walking in without knocking. He sat on the couch, making himself comfortable. Diane barely acknowledged him. She stayed in the kitchen, washing dishes even though they were already clean. Joel and I made small talk. He asked about the wedding, about Canada, about whether I'd thought about starting a business here. "You could open a dive shop," he said. "Tourists love diving. I could help you run it." I told him I'd think about it, but I wasn't interested. I just wanted him to leave. When he finally did, I asked Diane what was wrong. "Nothing," she said. "I'm just tired, Percy. Can we not do this tonight?" I didn't push. I went to bed. She stayed up, her phone glowing in the dark. I could hear her typing, deleting, typing again. I wanted to ask who she was talking to, but I was afraid of the answer. The next morning, I woke up to silence. I reached over. Her side of the bed was cold, empty. I sat up. "Diane?" No answer. I checked the bathroom, the kitchen, the porch. She wasn't there. Her phone was gone. Her purse was gone. I told myself she'd just gone out, maybe to the market, maybe to see her mom. But when I opened the closet, I saw it. Her clothes were gone. Not all of them, but most. The ones she wore every day. The ones that mattered. My chest tightened. I tried calling her. Straight to voicemail. I called again. Same thing. I called Vanjie. No answer. I called Joel. No answer. Panic set in. I grabbed my keys and drove to the village. The roads were rough and I was going too fast, but I didn't care. I needed to find her. I needed to know she was okay. When I got to Vanjie's house, the gate was locked. I knocked, pounded. "Vanjie, Dianne." Nothing. A neighbor peeked out from the house next door. An old woman with a scarf tied around her head. "They're not here," she said in broken English. "Where are they?" I asked. She shrugged. "They leave yesterday. With bags." My heart dropped. "Where did they go?" She shook her head. "I don't know." I stood there, staring at the locked gate. My mind was racing. Yesterday. They left yesterday, right after the papers were signed, right after the property became hers. I felt sick. I drove to Joel's place. Same thing. Locked, empty, nobody around. I tried calling Diane again. Again. Voicemail, voicemail, voicemail. I drove back to the house. My house that wasn't mine anymore. I sat on the porch and stared at the ocean. The sun was setting, beautiful, cruel. My phone buzzed. It was Rick. "You okay, buddy?" I didn't know what to say. I wasn't okay, but I couldn't say that yet. Saying it would make it real, so I hung up. I sat there for hours, watching the waves, listening to the wind, waiting for her to come back, waiting for an explanation, waiting for anything. She never came. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the porch, phone in hand, refreshing her last seen status on every messaging app. Nothing. I sent her a message. "Where are you? Please talk to me." Delivered, not read. I sent another. "Diane, I'm worried. Just let me know you're okay." Delivered, not read. By the time the sun came up, I'd sent 15 messages. None of them were opened. I called Addie, Santos. He answered on the third ring. "Mr. Percy, good morning." His voice was too calm, too professional. I told him Diane was gone, that her family was gone, that I couldn't reach anyone. He was quiet for a moment. "I see." That's all he said. "What do I do?" I asked. "Can I get the property back? Can I reverse the transfer?" He sighed. "I'm afraid not. The documents are legal and binding. The property is in her name. Unless she agrees to transfer it back, there's nothing you can do." I felt the floor drop out from under me. "So I just lose everything?" I said, my voice cracked. He spoke carefully. "You could pursue legal action, but it would be expensive and difficult to prove intent without evidence of fraud." I hung up. I couldn't listen anymore. I sat on the floor of the kitchen, my back against the cabinet. Everything I'd worked for, 40 years of saving, of building, gone, signed away to a woman I'd known for less than a year. I drove back to the village one more time. I had to find someone. Anyone. I saw Sophia, Dianne's cousin, walking down the dirt road. She saw me and looked away. I got out of the car. "Sophia, please." She stopped but didn't turn around. I walked up to her. "Where's Diane?" She kept her eyes on the ground. "I don't know." I could tell she was lying. "Please," I said. "I just need to understand. What happened?" She finally looked at me. There was pity in her eyes. "She left yesterday," she said quietly. "With someone else." The words hit me like a punch. "What do you mean, someone else?" Sophia hesitated. "She's been with him for a while, Percy. I thought you knew." I felt my knees go weak. "Who is he?" She shook her head. "I don't know his name, but he's from Manila. She's been seeing him since before you came back." I couldn't breathe. Before I came back, before the proposal, before the property transfer, while I was video calling her every night, saying I loved her, planning a future, she was with someone else. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. Sophia looked like she might cry. "I wanted to, but Diane said you were happy. She said you were helping the family, and I thought maybe it would work out." I stepped back. It was all a lie. Sophia didn't answer. She didn't have to. I got back in the car and drove. I don't remember where. I just drove until I ended up in the city. I parked near a mall and sat there. People walked by, laughing, shopping, living their lives. And I sat there, feeling like I didn't exist. My phone buzzed. Rick again. "You okay, buddy?" I stared at the message for a long time. Then I typed back, "No." He called immediately. "What happened?" I told him everything. The property, the transfer, Dianne disappearing, the other man. Rick was silent for a long time. Then he said, "I'm sorry, Percy. I really am. But you need to get out of there. Come home." I told him I couldn't. I'd sold everything. The house and street, John's, Margaret's things. I'd put it all into this, into her. "Then stay with me," Rick said. "I'll wire you money for a ticket. Just come home." But I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready to admit defeat, to face everyone back home and tell them I'd been a fool. So I told Rick I'd call him back. I hung up. I checked into a cheap hotel near the pier. $40 a night, thin walls, a bed that sagged in the middle, a window that looked out at a concrete wall. This was my life now. I lay down and stared at the ceiling. I thought about Diane, about the way she'd smiled when I proposed, the way she'd cried at the airport, the way she'd held my hand when I signed the papers. Was any of it real? I stayed in that hotel for 3 days. I didn't eat much, didn't sleep much, just replayed everything in my head. The first night we talked, the way she'd leaned her head on my shoulder on the beach, the trip to her village, her mother crying when I gave her money, Joel calling me family, Dianne saying, "I would never hurt you." Every moment felt tainted now, like I'd been living in a story someone else had written, and I was too blind to see the script. On the 4th day, I forced myself to go outside. I found a small cafe near the hotel. I ordered coffee and sat by the window. That's when I met Mark. He was Australian, early 30s, sitting alone at the next table. He glanced over and saw the look on my face. "Rough week?" he asked. I didn't answer at first, but then I nodded. "You could say that." He smiled, but it was a sad smile. "Let me guess. Filipina girlfriend?" I looked at him. "How'd you know?" He laughed bitterly. "Because I'm sitting here alone too, mate." He told me his story. He'd met a girl in Manila, fell hard, fast. She'd convinced him to invest in her family's business, $50,000. Once the money was transferred, she disappeared. Took me 3 months to track her down. He said, turns out she'd done it before, to 2 other guys. I felt a chill run through me. "Did you get your money back?" He shook his head. "Not a cent." We sat there in silence for a while. Then Mark said, "They're good at it, mate. They make you feel like you're the one, like you're special, like they've been waiting their whole lives for someone like you. But you're not special. You're just convenient. His words cut deep, because they were true. I wasn't special. I was just a lonely old man with money, and Diane saw that. She saw what I needed, and she gave it to me just long enough to get what she needed. "What are you going to do?" Mark asked. I told him I didn't know. "Go home, maybe. Start over." He nodded. "That's probably smart. This place will eat you alive, if you let it." He finished his coffee and stood up. "Good luck, mate. I hope it works out better for you than it did for me." He walked out. I sat there for another hour, watching people pass by, wondering how many of them had stories like mine. That night, I tried one more time. I wrote a long message to Diane. I told her I understood if she didn't love me, that I wasn't angry. I just wanted to know why. Why she couldn't just tell me the truth. Why she had to take everything. I poured everything into that message. My hurt, my confusion, my desperate need for closure. Then I read it back, and I realized how pathetic it sounded, begging for scraps of honesty from someone who'd lied to me from the start. So I deleted it, word by word, until the screen was empty. I didn't send anything. What was the point? I booked a flight back to Street John's 2 weeks later. Rick wired me the money. I told him I'd pay him back. He said not to worry about it. "Just get home," he said. The flight felt endless. I stared out the window, watching the ocean stretch on forever. I thought about Margaret, about how she'd always said I trusted too easily. She'd meant it as a compliment. Now it felt like a curse. When I landed, Rick was waiting. He didn't say anything, just grabbed my bag and walked me to his truck. We drove through the city in silence. The streets looked the same. The harbor, the boats, the gray sky. But I felt different, hollowed out, like I'd left pieces of myself scattered across Cebu and I'd never get them back. Rick drove me to a small rental near the waterfront. 1 bedroom, a kitchenette, a view of the ocean that reminded me too much of the house I'd lost. "It's not much," Rick said, "but it's yours for as long as you need it." I thanked him. He hesitated at the door. "Percy, I'm not going to say I told you so, but you know I'm here, right? If you need anything." I nodded. He left. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around. This was my life now, starting from scratch at 62. The next morning, I went down to the harbor. I needed to work, needed something to fill the hours. I talked to a few of the old guys I used to work with. They didn't ask where I'd been. They just handed me tools and pointed at boats. I fell back into the routine, fixing engines, patching hulls. The work was hard. My back ached, my hands cramped, but it kept me from thinking too much. People around town started asking questions. "Where have you been, Percy?" I'd say, "Away." They'd wait for more. I wouldn't give it. Eventually, they stopped asking. I became the guy who'd disappeared and come back quieter, sadder. People respected the silence. Months passed. Winter came. The cold settled in like an old friend. I'd sit by the window at night, watching the snow fall, thinking about Diane, not with anger, not even with sadness anymore, just with a strange, distant clarity. She didn't love me. Maybe she never did, and maybe I didn't really love her either. Maybe I just loved the idea of not being alone, the idea that someone young and beautiful could want someone like me, that I could have a second chance, that life wasn't over just because Margaret was gone. One night, I got a message from a number I didn't recognize. I opened it. "Percy, it's Sophia. I wanted you to know Diane got married. I thought you should hear it from someone who cares." I stared at the message for a long time. Then I typed back, "Thank you." I deleted the conversation. I didn't need to know more. I sat by the water that night. The ocean was black. The sky was full of stars. I thought about Margaret, about how she used to sit beside me on nights like this, not saying anything, just being there. I wondered if she would have forgiven me for being so foolish, for giving away everything we'd built together. Part of me thought she would. She always said people deserve second chances. even when they don't deserve them. But I also thought about what I'd learned, that loneliness makes you desperate, that desperation makes you blind, that you can love someone without really knowing them, and that sometimes the people who hurt you aren't villains. They're just people trying to survive in a world that doesn't give them many options. Diane wasn't evil. She was desperate, and I was convenient. That doesn't make it right, but it makes it real. I exhaled. The air was cold. It burned my lungs. But it felt good. It felt real. I was alone again. But this time, I understood why. And maybe that was enough. The ocean stretched out in front of me, endless and dark. I didn't know what came next, but I knew I'd survive. I'd survived losing Margaret. I'd survived losing everything else. I could survive this too. I stood up, walked back to my little rental, made a pot of coffee, sat at the table. The same table where I used to set out 2 cups by mistake. This time, I only set out 1. And it felt right. The ocean was cold, but it was home.